At 58, I thought I'd seen it all, until my best friend of 42 years showed up at my door, crying, desperate, begging for help. I took her in. I trusted her. But that's when the biggest betrayal of my life began. If you think you've seen it all, subscribe to the channel now, because this story will shock you as much as it destroyed me. And it starts with a phone call I should never have answered. My name is Margaret Sullivan, but everyone calls me Maggie, and at 58 years old, I thought I knew every lesson life had to teach me. We had lived in our colonial house in Westport, Connecticut, for over 3 decades. Bob and I built our life brick by brick, dream by dream. The blue hydrangeas I planted that first summer still bloom every year beside the porch, silent witnesses to everything we've lived there. You know how it is, don't you? When we look at our house and see our history etched into every corner, into every carefully chosen piece of furniture. Bob always said I had a gift for turning any space into a welcoming home, and perhaps that was my undoing. I believed hospitality was a virtue, that opening our doors to anyone in need was what decent people did. Our house had plenty of spare rooms since our children, Sarah and Michael, went off to live their own lives, she in Boston, he in Chicago. The loneliness of an empty nest sometimes echoed through the halls, but Bob and I had found our new routine. Dinners at the club on Fridays, gardening on weekends, and that quiet peace you imagine comes after decades well lived. How wrong I was about everything. Catherine Morrison, Kathy to her close friends, had been my best friend since high school in Westport. 42 years of friendship, can you imagine? We shared first kisses, graduation, weddings, the births of our children, and all those small joys and tragedies that weave the tapestry of a life. She was my maid of honor, I was hers. Twice, in fact, because her first husband, Paul, died in a car accident when she was only 30. Then she married Richard, a man who always made me feel a certain discomfort, though I could never explain exactly why. Maybe it was the way he looked at other women even when Kathy was by his side, or how he always found a reason to criticize her choices. Bob always said Richard was too intense, but I attributed that to male jealousy. You know how territorial men can be with each other. Kathy and I had that kind of friendship that survives everything. Moves, distances, phases of life. Or at least that's what I believed. If someone had told me that September that my oldest friend would become my greatest enemy, I would have laughed in their face. The call came on a rainy Tuesday, one of those typical September days in New England. I was organizing the last tomatoes from my garden when the phone rang, and something about the way it sounded, insistent, almost desperate, made me drop everything and run to answer. Kathy's voice was broken, interspersed with sobs I recognized from other crises over the years, but this time there was something different. "Maggie," she said, and just by the way she pronounced my name, I knew it was serious. "I need to tell you something, and you're going to be shocked." Richard had filed for divorce, but that wasn't all. He was taking everything. The house in Fairfield, their savings, even the car that was in his name. Apparently, he had been planning this for months, moving money, consulting lawyers, preparing his exit as if it were a business to be liquidated. "He said I never contributed anything real to the marriage," she whispered, and I felt my heart break at the tone of devastation in her voice. Perhaps you know that feeling, when someone we love is suffering, and we feel their pain as if it were our own. "Where are you now?" was the first question I managed to ask, because practical solutions were always my first reaction in a crisis. She was in a cheap motel on Route 1, living from diner to diner, trying to stretch the few dollars she had in her wallet after Richard changed the bank account passwords. "I can't even go back to get my decent clothes," she said, and I could imagine the humiliation that represented for a woman like Kathy, who had always prided herself on her impeccable appearance. She had been a real estate agent too, like me, but had stopped working when she married Richard, who insisted that a well-kept wife didn't need to work. Now, at 56, she was starting from scratch, with no income, no home, nothing but the clothes on her back. "Maggie, I have no one left," she said, and those words hit me like a punch to the gut. With no children of her own, her parents having passed years ago, Kathy truly was alone in the world. Bob wasn't home. He had gone golfing with his retired lawyer friends, so the decision was entirely mine. "Pack your bags," I said without hesitation. You're staying with us until you sort this out. When I hung up the phone, I stood in the kitchen for a few minutes, looking out the window at the garden Bob and I tended together every weekend. There was something prophetic about the approaching storm, dark clouds gathering on the horizon as if the weather itself knew changes were coming. I prepared the guest room that had been Michael's, still decorated with his baseball trophies and high school photographs, and changed the sheets for some more feminine ones I kept for special visitors. I made a mental list of all the things Kathy would need: shampoo, conditioner, a new toothbrush, maybe some comfort food for the first dinner. Bob arrived home around 6, still in his golf clothes and complaining about the rain that interrupted their game on the 9th hole. "Honey," I said, intercepting him before he could settle into his evening routine, "Kathy's going to be staying with us for a while." I explained the situation quickly, and to his credit, Bob didn't hesitate for a second. "Of course," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Poor Kathy. She can stay as long as she needs." That was the Bob I fell in love with. Generous, kind, always ready to help someone in need. Kathy arrived after 8 that night, driving a rented Honda Civic she could barely afford, carrying only 2 small suitcases and an expression of devastation I had never seen on her face. 42 years of friendship, and I had never seen her so broken, so lost. She had always been the more glamorous of us two, her blonde hair always perfectly styled, impeccable makeup even for a trip to the supermarket, clothes that cost more than I spent in an entire month. Now she was wearing wrinkled jeans and a blouse that clearly wasn't her first choice, her eyes red and swollen from crying so much. "Oh, Maggie," she said when I hugged her at the entrance, and she collapsed against me like a child seeking comfort. Bob appeared in the living room, awkwardly patting her shoulder and offering her a drink. Men never know what to do when women cry, do they? I took her to the guest room, helped her unpack, and noticed how her hands trembled as she handled each item of clothing. "You're safe now," I said, holding her hands to make them stop shaking. "We're family, Kathy. You're home." The first few days were exactly what you'd expect when someone you love is recovering from a major trauma. Kathy slept late, a blessing because she clearly needed the rest, and when she finally came down to the kitchen, I already had coffee ready and something cooking on the stove. We took long walks around the neighborhood, her telling me details about her marriage that I had never realized, how Richard controlled even what she wore to social events, how he constantly criticized her weight, appearance, opinions. "I lost myself, Maggie," she said one afternoon as we watched the neighborhood children coming home from school. "I don't even know who I am without Richard telling me." Bob was incredibly patient, adjusting his routine to accommodate our guest, never complaining about sharing his space or his wife's attention. He even offered to help Kathy find a good divorce lawyer, using his connections in the legal community. We had dinner together every night, playing board games afterward, watching old movies that reminded us of the good old days. It was as if we were teenagers again, only now with gray hair and a lifetime of experiences between us. I felt useful, needed, as if I were making a real difference in someone's life. After 2 weeks, Kathy began to show signs of recovery that filled me with hope and satisfaction. She started waking up earlier, offering to help with breakfast or household chores. She began to care for her appearance again, styling her hair, putting on makeup, choosing clothes more carefully. Bob commented one night that she was getting her sparkle back, and I felt so proud to have provided the safe space she needed to heal. We talked about future plans. Maybe she could restart her real estate career. Maybe we could even work together as partners in the same agency. She had great contacts in the area and natural charm that clients always loved. "You saved me, Maggie," she said one night as we cleaned up after dinner. "I don't know what I would have done without you and Bob." This filled my heart with so much affection. Isn't that what friendship should be? Being there when someone needs you most. Bob started including her in his social plans. Dinners at the golf club, neighborhood barbecues, poker nights with the guys where wives were welcome. Kathy was integrating into our life so seamlessly that it felt natural, comfortable, right? But it was around the 3rd week that I began to notice small things that didn't quite make sense, although I dismissed them as being overly sensitive. Kathy started using my perfumes without asking. Not that I minded, but it was unusual for someone who always had her own expensive fragrances. She started commenting on our house as if she were an expert. This kitchen could use a modernization, or that wallpaper is so outdated, observations that seemed strangely critical coming from someone who was our guest. One morning I found her in Bob's office, looking through papers on his desk, and when I asked what she was doing, she laughed as if it were nothing, saying she was just admiring his book collection. Bob started exercising more frequently, something he hadn't done consistently in years, and suddenly he was much more conscious about his appearance, ironing his shirts more carefully, wearing cologne again, even buying new clothes. When I mentioned it, he said Kathy had made some casual comment about how men our age need to stay in shape, and he decided she was right. Small things, insignificant details that a paranoid mind might overinterpret. I told myself I was being silly, protective of my space after years of peaceful routine. It was a Thursday night, almost a month after Kathy had moved in, that something happened I couldn't dismiss or rationalize. I had gone upstairs early with a headache, leaving Bob and Kathy watching some crime drama in the living room, their voices drifting up through the ceiling like comfortable background noise. But around 10 o'clock, I woke up needing water, and the house was strangely silent. As I walked downstairs in the darkness, I heard low laughter coming from the kitchen, intimate, muffled laughter that made me stop at the top of the stairs. Through the banister, I could see them standing very close at the counter, Bob's hand resting on Kathy's arm in a way that felt too familiar, too comfortable. They were whispering, heads tilted together like conspirators sharing secrets, and something about their body language made my stomach clench with unease. When I cleared my throat and continued down the stairs, they sprang apart like teenagers caught kissing, both laughing too loudly about something that clearly wasn't that funny at all. "Just making hot chocolate," Kathy said brightly, but there was no pot on the stove, no mug visible anywhere. Bob mumbled something about checking the locks and headed for his office, completely avoiding my eyes. Perhaps you know that feeling when something is wrong but you can't quite put your finger on it, when your instincts are screaming but your rational mind is making excuses. I went back to bed that night with a knot in my stomach that wouldn't go away, wondering if I was losing my mind or if my 30-year marriage was about to become something I wouldn't recognize. The next morning, I woke up with that strange feeling still clinging to me like a second skin. Bob had already left for his morning run, a new habit he had adopted since Kathy arrived, claiming he needed to take better care of his health. I went down to the kitchen expecting to find evidence of the hot chocolate from the night before, but the counters were immaculately clean, with no trace that anyone had prepared anything there. Kathy was still asleep as usual, so I made my coffee in silence, trying to organize my thoughts. Maybe you've experienced this, when something bothers you but you can't quite pinpoint what it is, when your intuition is whispering but your reason is shouting louder. I sat at the kitchen table where Bob and I had coffee for decades, looking out at the garden through the window, and wondered if I was becoming one of those paranoid women who see problems where none exist. After all, Bob and I had been married for 30 years. Surely I knew my husband well enough to know if something was wrong. But then why wouldn't that feeling of discomfort go away? Why did I feel like a stranger in my own home? When Bob returned from his run, sweaty and breathless, he gave me a quick kiss on the forehead and went straight upstairs to shower without even stopping to talk, as he always used to. Kathy came down around 10, wearing one of my bathrobes, another small detail that bothered me more than it should have. "I hope you don't mind," she said, noticing my gaze. "Mine is in the laundry." But I didn't remember seeing any of her bathrobes in the dirty laundry basket. She poured herself coffee and sat in my usual chair, the one facing the garden, forcing me to sit on the other side of the table. Small things, you might think, but when you've lived in a house for 3 decades, every change in routine resonates like an untuned bell. "I slept so well," she said, stretching like a satisfied cat. "This house has such good energy, so welcoming." There was something about the way she said, "this house," that made me feel like she was evaluating a property to buy. Bob came downstairs wearing a shirt I didn't recognize. Light blue, well-fitted, definitely new. "When did you buy that shirt?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Kathy helped me pick it out yesterday when we went to the mall," he replied, and I felt a pang in my chest. They had gone to the mall together? But I didn't remember anyone mentioning a trip to the mall. "You were busy with your clients," Kathy quickly explained, so I offered to go with Bob. He needed new clothes anyway. The rest of the morning passed in a strange fog of forced normalcy. Kathy offered to help with household chores, but in a way that seemed more like supervision than assistance. "Do you always wash dishes like that?" she asked, observing my technique as if she were an expert. "My mother always said very hot water dries out your hands." Her mother had died when we were teenagers, and I clearly remembered her saying she hated washing dishes anyway. Bob appeared in the kitchen several times during the morning, always finding excuses to be where Kathy was, getting a glass of water when she was organizing the pantry, looking for the newspaper when she was cleaning the coffee table. They had developed a subtle dance, always aware of each other's location, always finding reasons to be in the same room. When I suggested we go out for lunch, the three of us, Kathy said she preferred to stay home, to not spend unnecessary money, but offered to cook for us. "Let me take care of you two for a change," she said, and there was something possessive in the way she included Bob in that statement. Have you ever noticed how some people can make a generous gesture sound like a claim of territory? That's exactly how I felt, as if she were marking her space in my kitchen, in my house, in my life. During the lunch Kathy prepared an elaborate salad that Bob praised excessively. The conversation revolved around high school memories I didn't remember sharing with her. "Remember when you had that crush on the history teacher, Maggie?" she said, laughing. "You'd turn red every time he talked to you." Bob laughed too, as if it were the funniest thing in the world, but I didn't remember telling Kathy that story, let alone Bob. In fact, I was sure I had never told anyone about my teenage crush on Mr. Henderson. "I don't recall telling you that," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "Of course you did," Kathy insisted. "At the graduation party, you were a little drunk and confessed everything." But I hadn't drunk at the graduation party. My parents were very strict about that. Bob was looking between us with an amused expression, as if he were watching an interesting show. "Women and their memories," he said, shaking his head with a condescending smile that deeply irritated me. Since when did Bob talk about women as if they were a separate group he wasn't part of? Since when did he use that paternalistic tone with me? Kathy laughed and lightly touched his arm. "Men never understand how we remember every detail, do they, Bob?" And he laughed back, as if they shared an inside joke from which I was excluded. That afternoon, I decided to go shopping, partly because I needed a few things and partly because I wanted some time to think away from the strange atmosphere that had settled in my house. "I'm going to the supermarket," I announced. "Does anyone need anything?" Bob said he was fine, but Kathy asked me to buy a specific shampoo, an expensive brand she always used. When I got to the supermarket, I found myself walking through the aisles like a zombie, my mind constantly returning to the small details that were bothering me. Bob's new shirt, the borrowed bathrobe, the memories that didn't add up, the way they laughed together. In the beauty products aisle, I looked for the shampoo Kathy had asked for and found it cost $40, more than I spent on hair products in 2 months. For someone who claimed to be penniless, it was an interesting choice. I bought it anyway, feeling silly for questioning even that. Perhaps you know that feeling of doubting your own sanity, when every little thing seems suspicious but you can't justify why. On the way back home, I stopped at the traffic light in front of the diner where Kathy said she had spent the days before coming to our house, and wondered if I should go in and ask if anyone remembered her. But that would be crazy, wouldn't it? Investigating my own best friend as if she were a criminal? When I arrived home, the house was too silent. I called for Bob and Kathy, but got no answer. Their voices reached me from Bob's office, low conversations, almost whispers, that stopped abruptly when my footsteps echoed in the hallway. "Maggie." Bob called and there was something forced in his voice. "We're here in the office, looking at some old photos." I found them sitting very close on Bob's leather armchair, a photo album open on his lap. Kathy was leaning over him, so close her hair almost touched his face. "What photos?" I asked, approaching. "Oh, just some from the office," Bob quickly said, closing the album before I could see. Kathy was curious about my old cases. But that album wasn't of old cases, it was our honeymoon album, which had been stored on the bookshelf for years. Why would Bob lie about that? Why would Kathy be interested in photos from our honeymoon? They quickly stood up as if caught doing something wrong, and Kathy immediately started talking about how she was fascinated by Bob's legal career. There was a strange energy in the air, a tension I could feel but couldn't name. Bob avoided my gaze as he put the album away, and Kathy smiled too brightly, like an actress trying to convince the audience she was happy. That night, when I asked Bob about the photos, he said he didn't remember which photos they were, that it had been just small talk. But Bob never forgot details. He was a lawyer, after all. His memory was one of his best qualities. The following days brought more of these small moments that made me uncomfortable, as if I were watching my own life through a foggy glass. Kathy started reorganizing things in the house. Just to help, she'd say, but her improvements always involved changes that Bob enthusiastically approved of. She moved the plants in the living room to get more light, rearranged the books on the shelf in alphabetical order, and even suggested we move the dining room furniture for better flow. Bob, who normally resisted any changes in decor, agreed with everything she suggested. "Kathy has an excellent eye for design," he said one night, admiring the new furniture arrangement. "Maybe we should have asked her opinion years ago." Years ago? She had only been in our house for a month. When I mentioned that I liked the old arrangement, Bob and Kathy exchanged a glance, quick, almost imperceptible, but definitely a look of complicity. "Change is good, dear," Bob said, using a tone he normally reserved for explaining obvious things to difficult clients. "Sometimes we need to step out of our comfort zone." Since when did Bob talk to me as if I were a resistant client? Since when did he use Kathy as an example of what I should be? That night, lying in bed next to my 30-year husband, I felt like a stranger in my own life. It was a Friday that things got even stranger. Bob announced at breakfast that he had invited Kathy to join us for dinner at the golf club that night. "She needs to get out a bit," he said, as if it were his responsibility to take care of her social well-being. "Besides, it will be good for her to meet new people." Kathy politely protested, saying she didn't want to intrude, but it was obvious the idea pleased her. "I don't have anything appropriate to wear," she said, and Bob immediately suggested she buy something new. "On me," he quickly added when he saw my expression. "It's the least I can do for a family friend." Family friend? When did Kathy become a family friend instead of my friend? And since when did Bob offer to buy clothes for other women? He never even liked to come with me when I went shopping. "That's very generous, Bob," Kathy said, and there was something about the way she pronounced his name, softly, almost intimately, that made me nauseous. They went out together that afternoon to buy the dress, leaving me alone in the house that suddenly seemed too big and too silent. I sat in the living room, rearranged by Kathy, surrounded by furniture that was no longer where I had put it, and wondered when exactly I had lost control of my own life. Have you ever felt invisible in your own home? As if you were a guest in the life you built yourself? Dinner at the club was a nightmare of forced smiles and tense conversations. Kathy appeared wearing an elegant navy blue dress that enhanced her eyes and cost, I was sure, more than Bob spent on my clothes in an entire year. She looked stunning and everyone at the club noticed. "Who's your beautiful friend, Bob?" asked Harold Peterson, one of the oldest members. "This is Catherine Morrison," Bob replied, placing his hand on her back in a way that felt very familiar. "An old family friend who's going through a tough time." Old family friend again. When did that happen? Kathy charmed everyone at the table with funny stories and intelligent opinions about politics and business. She subtly flirted with the men and made the women feel included. It was a perfect performance from a woman who knew exactly how to behave in society. Bob watched her with an admiration that made me uncomfortable, as if he were seeing her for the first time. "You didn't tell me Kathy was so interesting," he whispered in my ear during dessert. Interesting? I had known Kathy for 42 years. When had she become interesting to my husband? On the way back home, Bob drove and Kathy sat in the front seat, leaving me in the back like a child. They talked about the people they had met, laughing at inside jokes I didn't understand, while I watched the backs of their heads and felt like an intruder in my own life. That night, after Kathy went up to her room, I confronted Bob about his behavior. "You were flirting with her," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. Bob laughed, but it wasn't a genuine laugh. "Don't be ridiculous, Maggie." I was just being polite to our guest. Burgess. Not my friend, not someone I was helping, our guest, as if she were both our responsibility. You bought her a $300 dress, I insisted. How do you know how much it cost? He asked, and there was something defensive in his voice that confirmed my suspicions. And even if it did cost that much, she needed something nice. The woman lost everything, for crying out loud. When did Bob start talking about Kathy as the woman, instead of using her name? When did he start defending her expenses as if it were his obligation? Bob, something is going on here, I said, finally verbalizing my fears. You've been acting differently since she arrived. He looked at me as if I had lost my mind. The only thing going on is that you're being paranoid and jealous of a woman who needs our help. Jealous? I had never been jealous in my life. Bob kissed me on the forehead as if comforting an irrational child and went to the bathroom to brush his teeth. I stood there in our bedroom, looking at the bed where we had slept together for 3 decades, and wondered if I was really going crazy or if my world was about to fall apart right before my eyes. That night, Bob slept facing the opposite direction, and for the first time in years, I felt cold in our bed. I woke up the following Saturday with a determination I hadn't felt in weeks. If I was becoming paranoid, as Bob suggested, then I needed concrete evidence to prove myself wrong. And if I wasn't becoming paranoid, then I needed that same evidence to confirm my worst fears. Bob had already left for his morning run, another new habit he claimed he was doing for his health, and Kathy was still asleep. I quietly got up and went to Bob's office, determined to find out why she was so interested in his papers. The desk was as organized as ever, but something was different. Some documents were in a slightly different order than Bob usually kept them. He was meticulous with his organization. Every paper had its specific place. I carefully opened the drawers, looking for anything that might explain Kathy's interest. In the bottom drawer, I found something that made my blood run cold. A copy of our tax return from the previous year, with several sections highlighted in yellow. Why would Kathy be interested in our financial situation? Why would Bob allow her to see such personal documents? I photographed the page with my cell phone, my hands trembling slightly. I was officially spying on my own husband, and the realization of it made me sick. When Bob returned from his run, I tried to act normally, but every movement felt forced. He showered and came down for breakfast wearing another new shirt, this time light green, which enhanced his eyes in a way I hadn't seen in years. You look different, I commented, serving him coffee. Different how? He asked, but there was a tension in his voice. More conscious of your appearance. More attentive to clothes, exercise. Bob laughed, but the sound didn't reach his eyes. Can't a man want to take better care of himself? Kathy appeared in the kitchen at that moment, wearing one of my casual dresses, another loan she hadn't asked permission for. Good morning, she said cheerfully, kissing Bob on the cheek as if it were the most natural thing in the world. When did that start? When did she start greeting my husband with kisses? Bob didn't seem surprised or uncomfortable by the gesture. In fact, he smiled in a way he hadn't smiled at me in months. I slept wonderfully, Kathy continued, pouring herself coffee into my favorite mug. This house has such positive energy. She said this looking directly at Bob, as if the positive energy came specifically from him. I felt a wave of anger rise in my chest, but I swallowed it with a bitter gulp of coffee. I decided to test my theory. Kathy, I said casually, do you remember the name of that motel you were staying at before you came here? She paused for a fraction of a second before replying. The Sunset Inn on Route 1. Why? Just curious. It must have been difficult to stay there. It was horrible, she said quickly. Noisy, dirty, no decent coffee. Later, when Bob left to run errands, I called the Sunset Inn. I'm sorry, the receptionist said, but we have no record of any Catherine Morrison in the last 6 weeks. I tried variations of the name. Kathy, Catherine Morrison Richards, even Catherine with her maiden name that I remembered. Nothing. My best friend had lied about where she was staying, but where was she really before she showed up at my door with that story of devastation? I called 3 more motels in the area, all with the same result. Catherine Morrison did not exist in any of their records. When Bob returned from shopping, I carefully watched his face as Kathy recounted the story of the horrible motel. He showed no surprise, no reaction that indicated he knew she was lying. Either he truly didn't know, or he was a better actor than I imagined. Neither option comforted me. That afternoon, while Kathy was showering, I decided to check her belongings. I felt terrible doing it, violating a guest's privacy, doubting a friend of decades, but the lies about the motel had planted a seed of suspicion I couldn't ignore. Her suitcases were organized with almost military precision. The clothes were expensive, too expensive for someone who claimed to have lost everything. I found tags from Manhattan stores on several items, all with recent dates. How had she bought designer clothes if she was penniless? At the bottom of one of the suitcases, I found something that confused me: an envelope with photographs. They weren't old family photos or sentimental keepsakes. They were photos of our house. Photos taken from different angles, some clearly taken from inside a car parked on the street. There were photos of Bob leaving for work, of me in the garden, even of our living room taken through the window. The photos had dates, all from 2 weeks before Kathy showed up at our door. She had been watching us. She had planned this. My best friend had spied on me even before inventing her crisis story. I put the envelope back exactly as I found it, but I photographed some of the images with my cell phone. My hands trembled so much that some photos were blurry, but I managed to get enough evidence. The question now was, evidence of what exactly? During dinner, I observed Kathy and Bob with new eyes. Every exchanged glance, every shared laugh, every casual touch took on a sinister meaning. When Kathy commented on how delicious the food was, Bob enthusiastically agreed, even though I had made the same dish hundreds of times without receiving such praise. When she suggested we watch a specific movie, Bob immediately agreed, even though it was a genre he normally detested. It was as if he was trying to impress her, to please her in a way he hadn't done with me in years. "You two seem to be getting along very well," I commented, trying to keep my tone neutral. "Kathy is an easy person to be around," Bob replied, smiling at her. "Intelligent, funny, interesting." Every adjective was like a small stab. When was the last time Bob described me as interesting? "It's wonderful to have such a close friend," Kathy said, but she was looking at Bob when she said it, not at me. Some friendships are too special for words. There was something about the way she emphasized special that made me nauseous. After dinner, they offered to wash the dishes together, insisting that I relax in the living room. Through the kitchen door, I could hear them laughing softly, whispering occasionally. When they returned to the living room, both seemed slightly flushed, as if they had shared something intimate. That night, Bob went to bed earlier than usual, claiming tiredness. But I heard him tossing and turning for hours, as if something was keeping him awake. On Sunday, I decided to conduct a more direct test. I announced that I needed to visit my sister in Hartford and would be gone all day. "Will you two be all right alone?" I asked, observing their reactions. Bob seemed slightly nervous. Of course. Kathy and I can manage." Kathy smiled brightly. "Maybe I can cook something special for Bob. He's been so generous." I left the house at 9 in the morning, but instead of going to Hartford, I parked at the end of the street, where I could observe our house unseen. I felt ridiculous, like a cheap private detective in a bad movie, but I needed to know what happened when I wasn't around. For 2 hours, nothing happened. Bob appeared at the window a few times. Kathy walked through the front garden watering plants that didn't need water. Then, around 11:30, I saw something that confirmed my worst fears. Bob and Kathy walked out the front door together, he carrying a small travel bag. They got into Bob's car and drove off in the opposite direction from which I had taken. Where were they going? Why did Bob have a bag? I followed them at a safe distance, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it over the sound of the engine. They drove to a boutique hotel in Stamford, the kind of place where Bob and I used to go for wedding anniversaries in the early years. I saw them enter together, Bob's hand on Kathy's back in a way that left no doubt about their intentions. My 30-year husband was having an affair with my best friend, and they weren't even trying to hide it. I sat in the hotel parking lot for almost an hour, trying to process what I had seen. Part of me wanted to go in and confront them immediately, make a scene that would make everything clear and definitive. But another part, the part that still hoped I was wrong, that still wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation, kept me in the car. Maybe it was a business meeting. Maybe Bob was helping Kathy with legal issues related to her divorce. Maybe the bag contained documents, not clothes for a romantic getaway. But even as I tried to convince myself of these possibilities, I knew I was lying to myself. Their body language, the way they entered the hotel, the intimacy between them, everything pointed to a truth I didn't want to accept. Finally, I drove back home and waited. They returned around 4 in the afternoon, both looking relaxed and satisfied. "How was Hartford?" Bob asked when I walked through the door. "Is your sister doing well?" I lied as easily as he was lying, saying it had been a pleasant visit. Kathy appeared in the kitchen wearing one of my aprons, preparing dinner as if she owned the house. "I hope you don't mind," she said. "I wanted to make something special for when you got back." There was something triumphant in her voice, as if she knew that I knew and didn't care. During dinner, they were more animated than usual, laughing at jokes I didn't understand, exchanging glances that completely excluded my presence. It was as if I were a ghost in my own life, watching my husband and my best friend build an intimacy that should have been mine. That night, after Kathy went up to her room, I tried one last time to confront Bob directly. "Where did you two go today?" I asked, feigning casualness. "Did we?" he replied, sounding genuinely confused. "I stayed home all day." "Kathy too." "Why?" The ease with which he lied shocked me more than the lie itself. This was the man with whom I had built a life based on honesty and trust. The man who always said that lies were the foundation of all problems in relationships. "I'm sure I saw you two leave together," I insisted. Bob laughed and shook his head. "Maggie, you're getting paranoid. That's not healthy." He approached and placed his hands on my shoulders, as he used to do when he wanted to calm me down. "Maybe you should talk to someone. The therapist, maybe. All this stress with Kathy here, the changes in routine, it's understandable that you're feeling confused." Confused? He was making me question my own sanity, making me doubt what I had seen with my own eyes. "I know what I saw, Bob," I said firmly. "You two left together today and you lied about it." His expression changed then, becoming cold in a way I had never seen before. "Maggie, you're behaving like a jealous and irrational woman. That doesn't suit you." Jealous and irrational woman. As if my feelings were symptoms of some female deficiency, not legitimate reactions to his behavior. That night, Bob slept on the couch, claiming I was too agitated to share the bed. It was the first time in 30 years that we had slept separately because of an argument. On Monday, Bob left early for what he said was a consultation with an old client. Kathy stayed home, claiming a headache, but I saw her from my office window talking on the phone in the garden, gesturing animatedly. When I went down to ask if she was feeling better, she quickly hung up the phone. "It was just my lawyer," she explained. "Divorce updates." But there was something in her expression that told me it wasn't true. During lunch, she made several comments about our house that deeply bothered me. "This kitchen has so much potential," she said, looking around as if evaluating renovations. "With a few changes, it could be truly spectacular." "I like the kitchen as it is," I replied. "Oh, of course," she quickly said. "It's just that sometimes an outside perspective can see possibilities we don't notice." Outside perspective? She was talking as if she were a design consultant, not a temporary guest. Later, I found her in our bedroom, claiming to be looking for aspirin in the bathroom. But the medicine cabinet was in the guest bathroom, not ours. "Sorry," she said when she saw me. "I'm still getting used to the house." Getting used to it? She had been here for over a month. How much longer did she plan to stay? And why was she exploring our room as if it were her territory? That afternoon, I checked my jewelry drawer and found that some pieces had been moved. Nothing was missing, but the organization was different. Someone had gone through my things, and I had a good idea who. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I could no longer live in this atmosphere of lies and suspicions. I needed concrete, irrefutable evidence of what was happening in my own home. After Bob and Kathy went to sleep, I installed a small voice recorder I had bought years ago for work meetings in the plant pot in the living room. If they were having intimate conversations when they thought I wasn't listening, I would find out. I also decided to hire a private investigator. I felt pathetic doing it, a 58-year-old woman spying on her own husband, but I saw no other choice. The next morning, I called a detective a client had used during her divorce. "I need to know if my husband is having an affair," I said directly, no beating around the bush. "And I need evidence." The detective, a man named Frank Morrison, was professional and discreet. "How long have you suspected?" he asked. "A few weeks," I replied. "But now I'm sure." We scheduled a meeting for the next day when Bob would be at work and Kathy, well, wherever she really spent her days. As I made these arrangements, I felt a strange mix of relief and terror. Relief because I was finally taking action, terror because I knew that once I had the evidence, there would be no turning back. My life as I knew it was about to end, and I myself was orchestrating its destruction. But I preferred the painful truth to comfortable lies. At least, that's what I told myself as I planned the investigation that would destroy my 30-year marriage. The meeting with Frank Morrison took place on a rainy Wednesday, in a discreet coffee shop in downtown Stamford. He was a middle-aged man, gray-haired with eyes that seemed to have seen every possible form of human betrayal. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, shaking my hand firmly, "I know this is difficult, but I need you to tell me everything from the beginning." I recounted the entire story. Kathy's arrival, the changes in Bob's behavior, the lies about the motel, the photos I found, the trip to the hotel. Frank took notes in a small notebook, occasionally asking specific questions about dates and times. "The woman in question," he said, "are you sure she is who she says she is?" The question caught me by surprise. "What do you mean?" "Well, you found out she lied about where she was staying. That makes me wonder what other lies she might have told." He was right. If Kathy had lied about something as basic as her accommodation, what else had she made up? "I need you to give me all the information you have about her," Frank continued. "Full name, date of birth if you know it, previous address, anything that can help me verify her real identity." I left the coffee shop with a mix of hope and terror, knowing that in a few days I would have answers to questions I didn't even know I should be asking. When I got home, I found Bob and Kathy in the kitchen, preparing lunch together with a domestic intimacy that made my stomach churn. They moved around each other with a familiarity that had taken Bob and me decades to develop. "How was your morning?" Bob asked, without looking up from the salad he was preparing. "Productive," I replied, watching how Kathy seasoned the meat with spices I didn't even know we had in the pantry. "Where did you find those spices?" I asked her. "Oh, Bob and I went to the gourmet market yesterday," she casually replied. "He said you wouldn't mind if we tried some new recipes." Yesterday? Bob had told me he spent the entire day in the office organizing old files. Another lie to add to the growing list. "It's good that you two are having fun," I managed to say, my voice sounding strange even to myself. During lunch, they talked about a movie they wanted to watch, a new restaurant they'd like to try, plans that clearly didn't include me. It was as if I were a stranger observing a couple's domestic life, not the wife of one of the participants. When I mentioned that maybe we could all go out together on the weekend, they exchanged a quick glance before Bob said he already had other commitments. What commitments? With whom? Since when did Bob make plans without consulting me? That afternoon, while they went out for what they called a walk in the park, I retrieved the recorder I had hidden in the living room. My hands trembled as I rewound the tape, preparing to hear evidence of the betrayal I already knew existed. The first recordings were normal conversations, discussions about the weather, comments about TV shows, nothing compromising. But then I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was Kathy's voice, low and intimate. "She suspects something, Bob. I saw how she looks at us." "Maggie has always been paranoid," came Bob's reply. "She'll get used to it." "What if she doesn't get used to it? What if she finds out about us?" There was a long pause before Bob replied. "Then we'll have to speed up our plans." "Plans? What plans?" I kept listening, my heart pounding so hard I feared it could be heard on the recording. "Are you sure she won't contest the divorce?" Kathy asked. especially when she finds out about the transfers. Transfers? What transfers? Maggie is a good woman, Bob said, and there was something condescending in his voice that made me nauseous. She'll accept a fair settlement, especially if we present things the right way. They were planning my divorce. My own husband was conspiring with my best friend to leave me, and apparently there were financial issues involved that I didn't even know existed. The recording continued with details that shocked me more and more. How much is the house worth again? Kathy asked. The last appraisal said $1.2 million, Bob replied. But with the improvements we've made, it's probably worth more now. Improvements we've made? I had paid for most of the renovations with my own real estate income. And the retirement accounts? Substantial. Maggie has always been good at saving. There was something in the way he said that made me realize he saw my savings as something he had a right to divide. How long do you think it will take? Kathy asked, and there was an eagerness in her voice that suggested she was in a hurry for me to leave the scene. A few months, maybe. I need to transfer a few more assets first, make sure everything is in order. Assets? What assets was he transferring? And where? Are you sure she won't hire a good lawyer? Maggie trusts me. She'll accept what I offer, especially if I say it's the best I can do. The arrogance in his voice made me furious. 30 years of marriage, and he thought I was so naive that I would accept any crumb he decided to give me. And then? Kathy asked. Then we'll have our life together, Bob replied, and I could hear the smile in his voice. Somewhere where no one knows us, where we can start fresh. They were planning to run away together. With my money. I turned off the recorder, my hands trembling with rage and shock. It wasn't just emotional betrayal, it was an elaborate financial conspiracy. Bob was planning to systematically rob me before abandoning me. And Kathy, my 42-year friend, was his enthusiastic accomplice. I rushed to Bob's office and started searching through his files with desperate urgency. I needed to understand what he had done with our money, what transfers Kathy had mentioned. I found bank statements that showed movements I didn't recognize, transfers to accounts I didn't know, substantial cash withdrawals. One account in particular caught my attention, a joint account in the name of Robert Sullivan and Catherine Morrison, opened 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks? They had opened a joint account even before I started seriously suspecting anything. The balance showed regular deposits that corresponded exactly to the miscellaneous withdrawals from our main account. Bob was systematically moving our money to an account he shared with Kathy. I photographed every document I could find, my hands trembling so much that some photos were blurry. When I heard their car arriving, I quickly rearranged everything and went up to the bedroom, pretending to be resting. But inside, I was seething with a rage I had never felt before in my life. During dinner, I observed Bob and Kathy with new eyes, knowing exactly what they were planning. Every fake smile, every casual lie, every complicit glance took on a sinister meaning. How was the walk? I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Wonderful, Kathy replied. We talked about so many interesting things. I'm sure they did. They probably discussed how to divide my assets after I was discarded. Bob told me about some of your most interesting cases, she continued. He's so intelligent, so experienced in legal matters. She was setting the stage, making me believe that Bob would be the right person to handle legal matters if I needed them. Like a divorce, for example. Maybe you should consider going back to work, Kathy, I suggested. Now that you're feeling better. She and Bob exchanged a quick glance. Actually, Bob said, I've been thinking about retiring early. Maybe Kathy and I can travel a bit, see the world. Travel together? With what money? Oh yes, with my money. What an interesting idea, I managed to say. Have you thought about any specific destinations? Maybe Europe, Kathy said dreamily. Or Costa Rica. Somewhere with a low cost of living where the money goes further. Low cost of living. Of course. Because they wanted the money they stole from me to last as long as possible. I finished dinner in silence, planning my own strategy while they planned my ruin. That night, after they went to sleep, I called Frank Morrison. I need you to speed up the investigation, I said in a low voice. And I need you to investigate financial matters as well. I told him about the recordings, about the joint account, about the escape plans I had discovered. Mrs. Sullivan, he said, and there was a gravity in his voice that scared me. This is more serious than a simple marital infidelity. We're talking about financial fraud, possibly theft. You need to protect your assets immediately. He gave me the name of a lawyer specializing in complicated divorces and advised me not to confront Bob until we had all the necessary evidence. If they know you found out, they might accelerate their plans and disappear with what they've managed to steal so far. The reality of the situation hit me like a train. It wasn't just my marriage that was in ruins, it was my financial security, my future, the entire life I had built. Bob wasn't just betraying me emotionally, he was systematically robbing me. And Kathy, the woman I had welcomed into my home, whom I had comforted and protected, was the architect of it all. I spent the night awake, listening to Bob breathe beside me, wondering how long he had been planning to destroy me. When had he stopped loving me and started seeing me as an obstacle to be removed? And how had I been so blind not to realize I was living with a stranger? The next morning, Bob announced he needed to travel for business for a few days. New York, he said, avoiding my gaze. An old client needs help with a complicated case. More lies. I knew he had no active clients, he was practically retired. Kathy will stay to keep you company, he added, as if doing me a favor. Kathy smiled sweetly. It'll be like old times, just the two of us. Old times when she wasn't stealing my husband and my money, I thought. After Bob left, Kathy behaved strangely, more relaxed, as if a pressure had been lifted. She made long phone calls that she cut short when I appeared, spent time on Bob's computer, checking emails, and even suggested we reorganize the master closet to optimize space. Why do you want to reorganize my closet? I asked directly. Oh, I just thought it might be helpful, she replied, but there was something in her eyes that told me she was evaluating my belongings, perhaps deciding what would be worth taking when she fled. That afternoon, she went out claiming she was going shopping, but returned with no bags. When I asked about the purchases, she said she didn't find anything interesting. More lies. It was becoming clear that neither Bob nor Kathy cared anymore about keeping their stories coherent. They were getting sloppy, too confident that I was too naive to notice their contradictions. It was on Thursday that everything exploded. Frank Morrison called with information that completely changed my understanding of the situation. Mrs. Sullivan, he said, I need to see you immediately. What I've discovered about your friend is disturbing. We met at the same coffee shop, but this time Frank seemed genuinely shocked. Catherine Morrison has a criminal history that she's hidden very well, he said bluntly. Fraud, embezzlement, seducing married men for financial gain. She's a professional con artist, Mrs. Sullivan. I felt the world spin around me. My 42-year friend was a criminal. There's more, Frank continued. She's done this at least 4 times in the last 15 years. Always the same pattern. She approaches wealthy married men, seduces them, steals what she can, and disappears for months or years before reappearing somewhere else. He showed me newspaper clippings, police reports, photos of Kathy with different men in different cities. Remember those periods when you went months without talking? Frank asked. When she traveled, or was too busy to keep in touch. I remembered. There were periods, especially in recent years, when Kathy simply vanished from my life for 6 months, a year, claiming to be finding herself or solving personal problems. She was running scams, Mrs. Sullivan. And now she's come back to run the biggest scam of all, on you. I returned home in shock, knowing that my decades-long friend had been a criminal all along, using our friendship as cover for her illegal activities. Kathy was in the kitchen preparing dinner, humming cheerfully as she always did when she was pleased with herself. How was your day? She asked with that smile I now recognized as the mask she had perfected over the years. Enlightening, I replied, observing her every move with new eyes. This woman had used our friendship as an alibi, disappearing to destroy other families and returning to my life as if nothing had happened. How many times had she lied about where she was during those silent periods? How many families had she destroyed while I believed she was finding herself? Bob called, she said casually. He's going to stay a few more days in New York. Said he's sorry, but the case is more complicated than he expected. More lies. Now I understood that Kathy had seduced Bob not out of impulse or passion, but as part of a calculated plan. She had returned to my life specifically to rob me, using decades of trust and friendship as a weapon against me. What a shame, I managed to say. I was looking forward to him coming back. Kathy looked at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. For a moment, I thought I saw something like nostalgia in her eyes, as if she almost missed the real friendship we had before she decided to destroy me. But then the moment passed, and she reverted to the professional con artist who had perfected the art of betraying people who trusted her. That night, alone in bed, I realized that I had not only lost my husband, but had also discovered that I never truly had the friend I thought I'd had for 42 years. On Friday morning, I woke up with an iron determination I hadn't felt in weeks. I knew exactly who Kathy was now, a professional con artist who had used our decades-long friendship as a cover for her crimes. But she didn't know I had discovered her true nature, and that would be my advantage. I went downstairs to the kitchen pretending normalcy, finding her already dressed and ready, unlike her usual routine of sleeping late. "You're up early today," I commented, pouring my coffee. "Oh yes," she said, looking slightly nervous. "I have some appointments to take care of. Divorce matters, you know." A lie. She was probably finalizing preparations for her escape with Bob. "Did Bob call?" I asked casually. "Too early to call," she replied quickly. "But he said yesterday he'd be back by the weekend." I watched her constantly check her phone, how her hands trembled slightly as she held her coffee cup. Something was happening and she was nervous. During breakfast, I noticed she ate very little, always glancing at the clock as if waiting for something. "Are you all right?" I asked. "You seem anxious." "Just anxious to get this whole situation resolved," she said, but she avoided my gaze. "Anxious to run away with my husband and my money, more likely." Around 10 in the morning, Kathy announced she needed to go out to handle some banking matters. "I should be back in the afternoon," she said, grabbing a purse that seemed heavier than usual. After she left, I rushed to the guest room and checked her belongings. Half of her clothes were gone. The drawers were organized differently, as if she had selected only the most valuable items to take. In the bathroom, her expensive beauty products had vanished, leaving only the basics. She was preparing to leave. I hurried to my bedroom and checked my jewelry box. My heart stopped. The most valuable pieces were gone: my grandmother's pearl necklace, the diamond earrings Bob gave me on our 10th anniversary, the gold bracelet that was a family heirloom. She had stolen my most precious jewelry, those with invaluable sentimental worth beyond their monetary value. I photographed the empty box and immediately called Frank Morrison. "She took my jewelry," I said, my voice trembling with rage. "And she's packing. I think they're going to flee today." "Don't despair," Frank said. "We expected this. I have men watching your house and the bank accounts. If they try to move, we'll know." But knowing wouldn't bring my jewelry back. It wouldn't undo the fact that the woman I had comforted and protected had stolen my family's most precious memories. Kathy returned around 2 in the afternoon, looking more relaxed, almost triumphant. "How were your errands?" I asked, observing her face carefully. "Resolved," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Finally I can move on. Move on with my money and my jewelry," I thought. During the afternoon, she made several phone calls, always stepping out into the garden for privacy. Through the window, I could see her gesturing animatedly, clearly coordinating something important. Around 4, my phone rang. It was Bob. "Hi, honey," he said, and there was something forced in his voice. "I have bad news. The case here is going to extend longer than I expected. I'll have to stay in New York for at least another week." "A week?" I repeated, loud enough for Kathy to hear. I saw her raise her head, paying attention. "That's too bad, Bob. I missed you." "Me too," he lied smoothly. "But it's an important opportunity. It can secure our retirement." Our retirement? As if we were still a couple planning a future together. I understand, I said. Kathy will stay with me then. There was a pause. Actually, Kathy mentioned she might need to travel too. Something about finalizing her divorce. Of course. They were coordinating their stories, preparing their excuses to disappear together. What a coincidence, I commented. You two traveling at the same time. After Bob's call, Kathy became visibly more agitated. She went up and down the stairs several times, always carrying small items that disappeared into her purse or the car. Are you all right? I asked when she passed through the living room for the 5th time in 10 minutes. Just organizing a few things, she said, but there was sweat on her forehead despite the air conditioning. Actually, Maggie, I need to tell you something. My lawyer wants me to go to Boston tomorrow. Urgent matters regarding the division of assets with Richard. Boston? What a creative lie. For how long? A few days, maybe a week. Depends on how the negotiations go. A week? The same amount of time Bob claimed he would be in New York. What bad luck, I said. I'll be alone just when I need company most. Kathy looked at me with a strange, almost guilty expression. I'm sorry, Maggie. I know the timing is terrible. Terrible timing for me, perfect for them. Don't worry, I said, forcing a smile. I'll manage. Maybe it'll be good to have some alone time to think. Think about how to destroy you too, I added mentally. That night, Kathy barely touched dinner, clearly too anxious to eat. She went to her room early, claiming tiredness, but I could hear her moving upstairs, clearly finishing her packing. I couldn't sleep that night, knowing that in the morning Kathy would leave with my jewelry and Bob would be somewhere planning our new life together with my money. Around 2 a.m, I heard a car stop in the street. Peeking through the bedroom window, I saw Bob getting out of a taxi. He wasn't in New York. He was here, probably to pick up Kathy and flee together. I saw him quietly enter through the back door, using the key we always kept under the plant pot. I pretended to be asleep when I heard footsteps in the hallway, but I kept my ears attentive. I heard whispers coming from Kathy's room, muffled conversations that lasted almost an hour. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of suitcases being dragged downstairs. They were leaving, but in the middle of the night, like thieves, which is exactly what they were. I waited until I heard the car driving away before I got up and checked Kathy's room. It was completely empty. She had taken everything, not even leaving a farewell note. 42 years of friendship, and she simply vanished in the dead of night like the criminal she always was. I went down to the kitchen and found an envelope on the table with my name on it. Inside, there was a letter from Bob asking for a divorce and claiming he had found true love. He didn't even have the courage to tell me personally that he was leaving me. Bob's letter was a masterpiece of manipulation and cowardice. He claimed our marriage had lost its passion years ago, that he deserved to be happy in his golden years, and that Kathy had awakened feelings he thought were dead. There was no mention of the stolen jewelry, the illegally transferred money, or the fact that he was running away with a professional con artist. Instead, he painted the situation as a late-in-life romance, a second chance at love that I should understand and accept. The letter ended with a generous offer of asset division. He would keep the house and retirement accounts, and I would receive a fair amount to start a new life. A fair amount. After 30 years of building our wealth together, he thought he could give me some crumbs and disappear. There were also instructions for me to contact a specific lawyer he had kindly chosen to represent me, probably someone who would work in his favor. I tore the letter into small pieces, my anger growing with every condescending word he had written. He really thought I was so naive, so submissive, that I would accept anything he decided to give me. I called Frank Morrison at 6 a.m. They fled, I said, and they took my jewelry. We already know, Frank replied. My men followed them to a hotel at the airport. They have a flight to Miami at 10 a.m. Frank met me at Hartford Airport an hour before Bob and Kathy's flight to Miami. We have enough evidence to arrest her for theft, he said, showing me photos of my jewelry that Kathy was wearing. And your husband can be charged with fraudulent transfer of marital assets. We watched from a distance as they checked in, Bob looking nervous and Kathy too confident for someone who was fleeing with stolen goods. She was wearing my pearl necklace as if it were rightfully hers. "Do you want us to arrest them now?" Frank asked. For a moment, I considered the satisfaction of seeing them handcuffed right there, in front of all the other passengers. But then I had a better idea. "No," I said. "Let them go. But keep them under surveillance. I want to know exactly where they go, what they do, how they spend my money." Frank looked at me curiously. "Do you have something in mind?" "I do," I replied, watching Bob kiss Kathy at the boarding gate as if they were newlyweds. "They want to play a game? Then let's play. But this time, I make the rules." I watched their plane take off, carrying my 30-year husband and my 42-year friend away, along with my jewelry and a significant portion of my money. But instead of feeling defeated, I felt a strange calm. They thought they had won, that they were too smart to be caught. They had no idea what was coming. Back home, the reality of my new situation hit me like a wave. The house was too silent, too empty, full of memories of a life that had been built on lies. Every room told the story of a marriage I thought was solid, of a friendship I believed was true. Bob's office still smelled of his aftershave. The guest room still had the imprint of Kathy's body on the mattress. I sat in the living room where we had watched so many movies together, where Kathy and I had talked about our dreams and fears, and allowed myself to feel the full pain of the betrayal. It wasn't just the loss of money or jewelry, it was the discovery that the two people I trusted most in the world had conspired to destroy me. Bob, who had promised to love and protect me until death do us part, had coldly planned my financial abandonment. Kathy, who had shared 42 years of secrets and tears with me, had used every intimate piece of information I shared to manipulate me better. I cried that morning. I cried for the naive woman I had been, for the marriage that was never real, for the friendship that was always a sham. But when the tears dried, what remained was something I had never felt before, a thirst for justice that consumed everything else. They had underestimated Margaret Sullivan. Now they would find out who I truly was when provoked. I spent the rest of the day documenting everything they had taken. Besides the jewelry, I discovered that Bob had emptied our emergency account, transferred funds from our investments, and even withdrawn the money I had saved for the kitchen renovation. The total amounted to almost $300,000, a substantial amount, but not devastating. They had been greedy, but not completely stupid. They left enough money in the main accounts so I wouldn't notice immediately, probably planning to come back for more after I signed the divorce papers. But what hurt most wasn't the money, it was the violation of trust, the discovery that my entire life had been a lie. I called my children to tell them what had happened. Sarah was furious, offering to come immediately from Boston. Michael was shocked, asking how he hadn't realized something was wrong. "None of yous did," I told him. "They were very good at what they did." But now I knew the truth, and that gave me an advantage they didn't expect. Frank Morrison called in the afternoon with updates. "They checked into a resort in Key West," he said. "They're spending money like there's no tomorrow. Expensive dinners, shopping, they even rented a yacht for tomorrow. Spending my money on their honeymoon. Their audacity was almost impressive." "Keep watching," I said, "and start gathering evidence of every cent they spend." That night, alone in the house that had been my home for 3 decades, I made the decision that would change everything. I would not be a passive victim crying over betrayal. I would not accept the role of the abandoned wife who accepts whatever crumbs she is offered. Bob and Kathy had chosen to see me as easy prey, a naive woman who could be manipulated and discarded. They were about to discover how wrong they were. I called the lawyer Frank had recommended, not the puppet Bob had suggested, but a specialist in asset recovery in marital fraud cases. "I want to get everything back," I told him. "Every penny, every piece of jewelry, every asset they stole. And I want them to pay for it." "That might take time," he warned me. "And it might get expensive." "I have time," I replied. "And I have resources they don't know exist." Because there was one thing Bob didn't know, I had inherited a substantial sum from my aunt the previous year, money I kept in a separate account as a surprise for our retirement. Ironically, the money I had saved for our future together would now fund my revenge against him. While Bob and Kathy celebrated in Key West, thinking they had escaped with the perfect crime, I was setting the trap that would destroy them. They wanted to play a game of betrayal and greed. Perfect. But this time, I would be the one to emerge victorious. The first few days after the escape were the hardest of my life. The house echoed with a silence that seemed to scream the betrayal that had taken place within its walls. Every morning I woke up expecting to hear Bob making coffee in the kitchen, expecting to see Kathy coming downstairs with that fake smile I now recognized for what it always was. But reality hit me like a cold slap. They were gone, taking not only my money and my jewelry, but also the illusion that I knew the most important people in my life. I spent hours sitting in the living room, looking at the empty spaces where they used to be, trying to understand how I had been so blind. The family photographs on the walls seemed to mock me. Bob smiling on our 25th anniversary, Kathy and I hugging at Sarah's graduation, moments I thought were genuine but now seemed like elaborate enactments. My children called constantly, worried about my silence, but how to explain that it wasn't just about Bob leaving me? It was about discovering that my entire life had been built on lies. It was about realizing that the woman I thought I was, intelligent, intuitive, good at judging people's character, had never existed. I was just a fool who had been manipulated for decades by people I loved. "He doesn't deserve your tears," Sarah said, hugging me. And she definitely doesn't. But I wasn't crying tears for them. They were tears for the woman I had been, for the life I thought I had had, for the trust that would never be the same again. Sarah stayed with me for a week, forcing me to eat, to shower, to get out of bed. But even with her there, I felt like I was watching my own life from the outside, as if I were a stranger trying to understand how I had gotten to that point. Frank Morrison called daily with updates about Bob and Kathy in Key West, but each report only increased my humiliation. They were living like kings with my money, dinners at five-star restaurants, shopping at expensive boutiques, yacht trips that cost more than I spent in an entire month. The photos Frank managed to show Bob kissing Kathy on the beach where we had spent our honeymoon 29 years ago, Kathy wearing my pearl necklace at a romantic dinner, the two of them toasting with champagne that probably cost more than my weekly salary. "They're not even trying to hide it," Frank commented during one of our conversations. "It's as if they want you to know how happy they are." Pebbit. With my life destroyed, they were happier than ever. I started to wonder if Bob had ever truly loved me, or if I had just been a convenience, a source of financial stability while he waited for something better. And Kathy, how many times had she laughed at me behind my back? How many times had she planned this moment while I was comforting her about her problems? The nights were the worst. Lying alone in the bed I had shared with Bob for 3 decades, I relived every conversation, every glance, every moment of the last few months, looking for signs I should have seen. They were all there, screaming their obvious betrayal, but I had been too blind, too trusting, too naive to notice. Depression arrived like a dark wave that completely engulfed me. I stopped getting dressed, I stopped eating regularly, I stopped answering the phone when it wasn't Frank or my lawyer. The house, which had always been my pride, began to reflect my mental state. Dirty dishes in the sink, mail piling up on the table, an abandoned garden where the plants Bob and I tended together began to wilt. Sarah showed up unannounced on a Thursday, finding me still in my pajamas at 3 in the afternoon, surrounded by used tissues and cold coffee cups. "Mom," she said, and there were tears in her eyes. "You can't go on like this." But how to explain that it wasn't just about Bob leaving me? It was about discovering that my entire life had been built on lies. It was about realizing that the woman I thought I was, intelligent, intuitive, good at judging people's character, had never existed. I was just a fool who had been manipulated for decades by people I loved. "He doesn't deserve your tears," Sarah said, hugging me. And she definitely doesn't. But I wasn't crying tears for them. They were tears for the woman I had been, for the life I thought I had had, for the trust that would never be the same again. Sarah stayed with me for a week, forcing me to eat, to shower, to get out of bed. But even with her there, I felt like I was watching my own life from the outside, as if I were a stranger trying to understand how I had gotten to that point. It was during one of those dark nights that I found something that changed everything. Sarah had insisted that I organize Bob's papers for the lawyer, A task I had been putting off because going through his things made me nauseous. But she was right. I needed to face the reality of the situation. At the bottom of an office drawer, I found an envelope I hadn't seen before, hidden behind old files. Inside were documents that made my blood run cold. Correspondence between Bob and a private investigator, dated 6 months before Kathy appeared at our door. Bob had hired someone to investigate our financial situation, our assets, even my habits and routines. There were detailed reports about my work schedule, places I frequented, people I talked to. He had studied me like a predator studies its prey, looking for vulnerabilities he could exploit. But what shocked me most was a letter from Kathy to Bob, dated 8 months ago, long before she appeared, desperate, at my door. "Dear Bob," the letter began, "I can't wait for us to start our life together. The plan is working perfectly. Maggie suspects nothing as always." As always. This meant they had been planning this for much longer than I imagined. Perhaps years? Perhaps our entire friendship had been an elaborate farce, with Kathy collecting information about my life to use against me when the time came. The discovery of these documents was like receiving a second blow, even more devastating than the first. Not only had Bob and Kathy betrayed me, they had meticulously planned my destruction for months, perhaps years. Every intimate conversation I had with Kathy about my fears, my dreams, my marital problems had been reported back to Bob, who used that information to become the husband I wanted him to be in the months before her arrival. The flowers he started giving me, for no reason, the romantic dinners he suggested, to rekindle our passion, even the more affectionate way he started treating me, everything had been calculated to make me more vulnerable, more willing to open my home and heart to Kathy when she appeared. I sat on the office floor, surrounded by evidence of the conspiracy against me, and felt something break inside my chest. It wasn't just my heart, it was my faith in humanity, my ability to trust, my belief that people are fundamentally good. How can someone plan another person's destruction with such care, such coldness? How could Bob kiss me goodnight knowing he was planning to abandon me? How could Kathy hug me and comfort me knowing she was collecting information to use against me? I called Frank Morrison, my hands trembling. "I found something," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "They planned everything. For months. Maybe years." "Bring it all to me," he said immediately. "This completely changes the case. It's not just betrayal, it's conspiracy to commit fraud." The following days passed in a haze of lawyers, documents, and increasingly shocking revelations. The investigator Frank hired discovered that Bob had opened secret bank accounts over a year ago, regularly transferring small amounts so I wouldn't notice. There was also evidence that he had forged my signature on some documents, making me a co-signer on loans I didn't even know existed. "Your financial situation is worse than we thought," my lawyer informed me during a meeting that made me nauseous. "But we also have enough evidence for criminal charges, not just civil." Criminal charges. My 30-year husband could go to prison. The idea should give me satisfaction, but instead it left me feeling empty. How had our life come to this point? Michael came from Chicago to support me during the legal meetings, and seeing the anger in his eyes when he learned the details of the betrayal made me realize that it wasn't just my life that had been destroyed. My children had also lost the father they thought they knew, the honorary stepmother they thought they loved. "How could they do this to you?" Michael asked one night after a particularly difficult meeting. "How can anyone be so cruel?" I had no answer. Perhaps some people were simply capable of a malice that others couldn't comprehend. Perhaps I had been lucky to live 58 years without encountering that kind of cruelty, until it appeared disguised as love and friendship. It was during this darkest period that I received an unexpected call that changed my perspective on everything. It was Frank Morrison, but this time he had different information. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, "while investigating Catherine Morrison's past, I found something interesting. A woman named Patricia Williams, from Phoenix, Arizona, was also her victim 3 years ago." My heart raced. Another of Kathy's victims. Frank had gotten Patricia's contact through old police records and reports from investigators who had worked on her case. "She went through the exact same situation as you," Frank continued. Catherine approached her husband using a similar story: financial problems, difficult divorce, needing a place to stay. She destroyed their 22-year marriage and ran off with $300,000. Frank gave me Patricia's number, and when I called her, it was like talking to a mirror of my own suffering. Patricia told me details that were eerily familiar: the way Kathy had integrated into their lives, how she had gradually seduced her husband, how she had stolen family jewelry before disappearing. But here's the thing, Patricia continued, she's not as smart as she thinks. She makes the same mistakes, uses the same methods. And I managed to track her down after she destroyed me. Track Kathy? How? She has expensive habits, specific spas, exclusive restaurants, luxury hotels. She can't resist the lifestyle that stolen money provides. And she always goes back to the same places. Patricia had spent 2 years documenting Kathy's patterns, collecting evidence, building a case. I'm organizing a group of her victims, she said. Women like us who were destroyed by her. Together, we can do something none of us could do alone. The conversation with Patricia was like finding a light at the end of a very dark tunnel. She connected me with other victims of Kathy. There were at least 6 women she had managed to identify, all with similar stories of betrayal, theft, and abandonment. We talked for hours on the phone, sharing our experiences, our pain, our anger. It was comforting to know that it wasn't my fault, that I hadn't been especially stupid or naive. Kathy was simply an experienced predator who had perfected her technique over the years. The difference, Patricia told me, is that you have resources we didn't have. You can hire the best investigators, the best lawyers. You can do what we couldn't do, stop her definitively. She was right. My inheritance from my aunt, which I'd kept secret from Bob, gave me a financial advantage that the other victims didn't have. I could fund a full investigation, track Kathy's every move, build a case so solid that she could never do this to another family again. But it's not just about the money, one of the other women, Janet from Seattle, told me during a conference call. It's about stopping her from destroying more lives. How many more families will she destroy if we don't stop her? They were right. This was bigger than my personal pain, bigger than my need for revenge. It was about protecting other women from going through what we went through. Slowly, with the support of the other victims and the love of my children, I began to emerge from the depression that had consumed me. It wasn't that the pain had disappeared, it was still there, a deep wound that might never completely heal. But now it had a purpose. Every tear I shed, every sleepless night, every moment of humiliation transformed into fuel for my determination. Kathy had chosen the wrong victim this time. I started taking care of myself again. Not for Bob, who would never deserve my attention again, but for myself. I went back to work part-time in real estate, finding comfort in routine and normalcy. My colleagues were incredibly supportive, never asking intrusive questions, just offering silent support when I needed it. I started therapy, not because I was crazy, as Bob had suggested, but because I needed to process the betrayal and rebuild my ability to trust. You are stronger than you think, my therapist, Dr. Rebecca Chen, told me during a session. Surviving this kind of betrayal and still having the energy to fight for justice shows extraordinary strength of character. Strength of character. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was stronger than Bob and Kathy imagined when they decided to use me as a victim. They were about to discover exactly how strong I could be when provoked. By the end of the second month after the escape, I was a different woman from the one left behind that morning. The pain was still there, but now it was tempered with determination and purpose. Frank Morrison had tracked Bob and Kathy to a luxury condominium in Miami they had rented for 6 months, clearly planning a long stay while spending my money. They're getting sloppy, Frank reported to me. Spending a lot, drawing unnecessary attention. Kathy even posted photos on social media wearing your jewelry. Posted photos of my jewelry. The audacity was impressive. She wants you to see, Frank continued. She wants you to know how happy she is with her life. But if Kathy wanted to play psychological games, she had chosen the wrong opponent. I was no longer the naive woman who had opened her door to a friend in crisis. I was a woman who had hit rock bottom and discovered it was made of solid rock. Patricia and the other victims had given me something I didn't know I needed: a support network of women who understood exactly what I was going through. My children had given me unconditional love and strength to continue. And my own experience had given me something Bob and Kathy never expected me to have: the iron determination of a woman who had nothing left to lose. They had completely underestimated me. Now it was time to show them who Margaret Sullivan truly was when pushed beyond her limits. The first meeting with Kathy's victims group took place via videoconference on a Tuesday evening, 3 months after the escape. 6 women appeared on my computer screen, each bearing the marks of betrayal that I knew so well. Patricia Williams coordinated the meeting with the efficiency of someone who had transformed her pain into purpose. "Welcome, sisters in suffering," she said, and there was a bitterness in her voice that echoed my own feelings. One by one, they told their stories, and it was like hearing variations of the same nightmare. Janet from Seattle had lost not only her husband but also the family home when Kathy convinced her husband to take out a second mortgage. Maria from Denver had been left with credit card debts she didn't even know existed. Linda from Atlanta discovered that Kathy had stolen her teenage daughter's identity to open bank accounts. Each story was a different facet of the same calculated cruelty, the same total lack of human empathy. "The pattern is always the same," Patricia explained. "She studies the family for months before approaching. She identifies vulnerabilities in the marriage, weaknesses in the husband, moments when the wife is most susceptible to manipulation." It was exactly what had happened to me. Kathy had reappeared in my life precisely when Bob and I were going through a more distant phase, when I was feeling invisible and unappreciated. She had timed her arrival with the precision of an experienced predator. During the meeting, I discovered details about Kathy's past that left me even more shocked. "She uses variations of her name depending on the situation," Patricia explained. "Sometimes it's Catherine Richards, other times Catherine Mitchell. She has at least 5 different identities that we've been able to document." Linda from Atlanta had obtained information through a private investigator who traced Kathy's criminal history. "She started early," Linda said, sharing documents on the screen. At 16, she was arrested for stealing jewelry from the family hosting her as an exchange student. At 20, she seduced and robbed a married professor. At 25, she pulled her first major scam, a businessman in Dallas who lost $500,000. Kathy's criminal history spanned more than 3 decades, an entire career built on the destruction of families. "She's good at what she does because she's been practicing for a long time," Maria from Denver added. "And because she genuinely feels no remorse. Psychologists have a name for it: sociopathy." The word hung in the air like a toxic cloud. My 42-year-long friend was a sociopath who had spent decades perfecting the art of destroying lives. "But here's the thing she doesn't know," Patricia said with a grim smile. "This time, her victims have united. And we have resources she's never faced before." Janet from Seattle had brought information that completely changed my understanding of the situation. "I gained access to old criminal records through a private investigator," she said, opening a digital folder. "Catherine Morrison has a history dating back to her teens, but she always managed to keep things secret, away from people like you." I felt the world spin. "What do you mean?" "She started young. At 17, she was arrested for stealing money from a family she was babysitting for, but the records were sealed because she was a minor. At 20, she seduced a married professor and blackmailed him for money. At 25, she pulled her first major scam on a businessman she met at a party." This explained the periods when Kathy disappeared from my life: the trips to find herself, the jobs in other cities, the months of silence I always attributed to normal phases of friendship. "She always returned to her normal life after each scam," Janet continued. "She used you as an anchor, as proof that she was a respectable person. Having a longtime friend, a seemingly stable life, helped her appear trustworthy to her next victims. 42 years of friendship, and I had been her cover the entire time. Every time she came back into my life after months of being gone, crying about relationships that didn't work out, or job opportunities that failed, she was actually recovering from her crimes, using our friendship to emotionally rehabilitate herself before the next scam. The depth of the manipulation was almost incomprehensible. Maria from Denver brought even more disturbing revelations about Kathy's methods. She doesn't work alone, Maria explained, showing photographs and documents. There's a network of people who help her: document forgers, hackers who access personal information, even other con artists who do reconnaissance work. A criminal network. Kathy wasn't just a lone sociopath, she was part of an organization that specialized in destroying families. Your husband Bob probably doesn't know this, Maria continued. She sees him as just another target, not a real partner. When she finishes using his money, she'll discard him too. The idea should have given me some satisfaction, knowing that Bob would also eventually be betrayed by the woman he abandoned me for. But instead, I felt a strange mix of pity and horror. Bob was an idiot, a traitor, a thief, but he didn't deserve to be destroyed by a professional sociopath. No one deserved that. We have evidence that she's already preparing to abandon him, Linda from Atlanta added. Our investigator in Miami reported that she's been meeting other men, always in expensive hotels, always when Bob isn't around. Other men? Of course. Bob thought he had found the love of his life, but for Kathy he was just another mark on a long list of victims. The irony was almost poetic, if it weren't so tragic. Patricia then revealed the plan she had been developing with the other victims. Each of us tried to get justice individually and failed, she said. Kathy always manages to escape because she moves quickly, changes identities, disappears before authorities can act. But this time it will be different. They had spent 2 years collecting evidence, documenting patterns, building a case that spanned multiple states and multiple jurisdictions. We have enough evidence for federal charges, Janet explained. Mail fraud, identity theft across state lines, conspiracy to commit financial crimes. If we can coordinate everything correctly, she will have nowhere to run. The plan was ambitious and complex. Each of us would file a complaint simultaneously in our respective states, creating a web of accusations that would make it impossible for Kathy to escape. But we need perfect timing, Patricia emphasized. If she suspects we're organizing, she'll disappear again, and it could take years to find her. It was risky, but it was our best chance to get real justice. There's one more thing, Maria said hesitantly. For this to work, we need her to stay in one place long enough for the authorities to act. And based on her patterns, she usually stays with each victim for about 6 months before moving on. 6 months? Bob and Kathy had been together for 3 months. We had a window of opportunity, but it was closing fast. After the meeting, I stayed awake all night processing everything I had learned. It wasn't just about my personal betrayal. It was about a predator who had spent decades destroying families, stealing not just money and possessions, but also people's ability to trust, to love, to believe in human goodness. How many women like me were out there, destroyed by Kathy, not knowing they weren't alone? How many were still blaming themselves, questioning their own judgment, wondering how they had been so stupid? The next morning brought a call from Frank Morrison with news that confirmed our worst fears. She's moving again, he said. Our man in Miami reported that she made several calls to travel agencies yesterday. And Bob seems to be getting suspicious. They had a public argument at the hotel restaurant last night. The argument had been about money, according to Frank's source. Bob was questioning Kathy's excessive spending, worried they were drawing too much attention. She's accelerating the timeline, Frank continued. She'll probably try to extract as much as she can from him in the coming weeks and then disappear. I immediately called Patricia. We have to act now, I said. She's preparing to flee. I was already expecting this, Patricia replied. Everyone else is ready. We can initiate coordinated legal actions tomorrow. Tomorrow? After months of planning, the time had finally come for Kathy to face the consequences of her actions. That afternoon, I made a decision I knew would change everything. Call Bob. He answered on the third ring, and his voice sounded surprised and slightly guilty. Maggie? Is everything all right? I need to talk to you, I said, keeping my voice neutral. It's about Kathy. There was a long pause. What about her? I know who she really is, Bob. I know about her criminal past, about the other families she destroyed, about what she's planning to do to you. Another pause, longer this time. What are you talking about? Kathy is a professional con artist, Bob. She has a 3-decade criminal history of destroying marriages and robbing families. And you're just another target on her list. I could hear his heavy breathing through the phone. That's ridiculous, Maggie. You're trying to separate us because you're jealous. She's already preparing to abandon you, I continued. Our investigators have seen her with other men. She's looking for her next victim while spending your money. You're lying, he said, but there was uncertainty in his voice. I'm sending evidence to your email now, I said. Photos, documents, criminal records. When you see everything, you'll understand that you're also her victim. I hung up before he could reply. I wasn't trying to save my marriage, that was dead and buried. But Bob deserved to know the truth about the woman he had chosen over me. And more importantly, if he confronted Kathy with this information, she might panic and make a mistake that would give us the final evidence we needed. The next 24 hours were the most tense of my life. Frank Morrison had positioned surveillance teams at strategic points around the hotel where Bob and Kathy were staying. Patricia and the other victims were in constant contact, coordinating with their respective lawyers and local authorities. Everything depended on Bob doing the right thing, confronting Kathy with the evidence I had sent. Around 8 that night, Frank called with the update we had been waiting for. It happened, he said. Bob confronted her in their room. Our source at the hotel said there were screams, things being broken. She left the hotel in a hurry with 2 suitcases, leaving Bob behind. Kathy had fled, but this time we were ready. She's driving north on Auto 95, Frank continued. We have teams following at a safe distance. It looks like she's heading to Jacksonville. She probably has an escape plan set up there. Jacksonville was where Linda from Atlanta had traced one of Kathy's false identities. She was following a pattern we had anticipated. Federal authorities are being notified now, Frank said. With the coordinated complaints from all 6 of you, they have authorization to arrest her as soon as she stops. After decades of destroying lives, Catherine Morrison would finally be held accountable for her crimes. But even knowing that justice was coming, I couldn't feel satisfied. Many lives had been destroyed, many families ruined. Her arrest wouldn't undo the damage she had caused. Kathy's arrest happened on a Thursday morning at a gas station on the outskirts of Jacksonville. Frank called me with the details while I was having coffee in the kitchen she had reorganized just a few months earlier. She didn't resist, he said. In fact, she seemed almost relieved when the federal agents approached, as if she knew this day would eventually come. Relieved. Perhaps after decades of living a lie, always being someone she wasn't, there was a part of her that wanted it all to end. And Bob? I asked, though I wasn't sure if I really wanted to know. Still in Miami, trying to understand what happened. Federal agents want to talk to him too. He could be charged as an accomplice, depending on what he knows about her activities. Bob as an accomplice. The idea was both satisfying and sad. Satisfying because he deserved to face consequences for betraying and robbing me. Sad because it meant that the man with whom I had spent 30 years of my life had truly become someone I didn't recognize. Patricia called an hour later, her voice filled with emotion. We did it, Maggie. After all these years, all these destroyed families, we finally did it. But the victory tasted bitter. Yes, Kathy was arrested. Yes, there would be justice. But that wouldn't bring back the lost years, the destroyed marriages, the broken trust. It wouldn't undo the fact that I had not only lost my husband but also discovered that my 42-year friend had used me as a cover for her crimes for decades. In the days following the arrest, the story exploded in national media. Relationship con artist arrested after decades of crimes, screamed the headlines. Reporters called constantly, wanting interviews, details, the victim's perspective on the story. I refused most, but agreed to speak with an investigative journalist who was writing an article about relationship scams and how to protect families. What do you want people to know? She asked during our phone interview. That this can happen to anyone, I replied. No matter how intelligent you are, how careful, how good at judging people's character. Predators like Catherine are experts at exploiting our humanity, our capacity to love, to trust, to help others in need. The journalist asked more questions about warning signs, about how I felt now, about my plans for the future. But the question that struck me most was the last one. Can you forgive? I remained silent for a long moment, thinking. Forgive Bob for betraying me, robbing me, abandoning me? Forgive Kathy for using our friendship as a weapon against me, for using me as a cover for her crimes for decades? Forgiveness isn't about them, I finally said. It's about me. It's about not letting their bitterness consume me for the rest of my life. So yes, eventually I will forgive. Not because they deserve it, but because I deserve peace. And at that moment, for the first time in months, I felt that perhaps it really was possible to find that peace. 6 months later, justice had run its course more completely than I dared hope. Kathy was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison for multiple counts of fraud, theft, and conspiracy, facing simultaneous lawsuits from all 6 victims Patricia had gathered. Bob received 3 years in prison for complicity and marital fraud, but his full cooperation with authorities allowed for the recovery of almost all the money that had been stolen, not just mine, but also funds hidden in secret accounts Kathy had maintained for years. The FBI discovered a complex network of assets she had accumulated over decades, allowing many of her previous victims to finally recover at least part of what they had lost. Patricia Williams called me last week to say she had received a restitution check covering 70% of her losses. It's not just about the money, she said, and I understood perfectly. It was about knowing that the woman who had destroyed our lives could never do that to anyone else again. As for me, I recovered not only my material possessions but something far more valuable: the certainty that it was possible to survive the deepest betrayal and still find peace. Some wounds leave permanent scars, but they also teach us our own strength. And that strength, I discovered, was something no one could ever steal from me.